You are listening to the War on the Rocks podcast on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. My name, of course, is Ryan Evans. I'm the founder of War on the Rocks. In this episode, I sat down with Justin Vaïsse. He's a French historian. He used to be the director of policy planning at the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and now he serves as Director General of the Paris Peace Forum. I spoke to him not long after he was traveling in China with President Macron, among others, and we had an interesting conversation. So you were recently on President Macron's delegation to China. What was the main purpose of that trip? What were your big impressions?
Yeah, I was invited to be part of the delegation alongside a number of CEOs, but also artists, people from civil society and elected officials, etc. And the main objective of the trip was to reestablish people-to-people contact, I would say, first between Macron and Xi, who had not met for the past 3 years, and also to sort of reopen China, if you'd like, by making sure that cultural and commercial ties would be reestablished. That's the first goal, I would say. The second one, which was really important for Macron, was to make sure that China would play a positive role in the global governance issues that he cares about. More specifically, the June summit on the new financial pact that Macron has convened on June 22nd and 23rd in Paris, and which aims at sort of reforming the international financial architecture so that we can finance both development, the SDGs, etc., and climate and the climate goals.
A lot of this seemed about business. You know, Macron brought members of the business community. He brought, it was almost like a trade delegation in some ways. And Macron's gotten some criticism for that, especially in an era where, there's obviously these major ongoing human rights concerns with China, but also China has been rather supportive of Russia as it's waged its war in Ukraine.
Which head of state does not travel with a trade delegation, right? And you have to put things in perspective. French trade with China is around $90 billion a year. U.S. trade with China is what, 690? So it's just $600 billion more. So I think
China's $600 billion more than the U.S., you're saying?
No. So U.S. trade with China is around $690 billion trade with China. So that's 600 more than with France. That was my point. And what I mean by that is that it doesn't. So it's about a third of German trade with China. So I don't think these issues are paramount in the relationship. If anything, France is really late in developing trade and investment ties with China. So I don't think it was really very, very important. No, once again, I really think the concern about China playing a positive role, whether it's on, as we saw in the recent month, by the way, either on the BBNJ treaty on the high seas last month, or...
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So basically for years, the world has tried, the international community has tried to get an agreement on, protecting the high seas. That is all the areas beyond national jurisdiction, which is really important both in terms of biodiversity and climate. And the agreement that was reached in New York in March that paves the way for a treaty. And bear in mind that we've not signed a big UN treaty for years, right? That has not happened. It looks like the UN is now incapable of producing treaties like in the midst of the Cold War, we were able to. So that was a victory, and China played, if not a very constructive and active role in it, at least a positive role in that, sort of echoing what had happened during the Kunming Montreal conference on biodiversity in December. So that is slightly reassuring in terms of making progress in global governance in spite of the US-China rivalry.
You toured different parts of China. What were your major impressions, especially China's not too recently come out of zero tolerance COVID policy, zero COVID? What were your impressions on that front?
Well, all the people that I was able to talk with, about a dozen people, whether Westerners in China or Chinese, with a softer voice, I would say for the latter, describe the sort of extraordinary extent of control during the zero COVID and how harsh the policy was, and also how mind-boggling was the decision to just jettison the zero COVID policy overnight. whereas things were incredibly strict and places for putting sick people were being built. Overnight, it stopped, and then suddenly there was no COVID anymore. Of course, that paved the way for a huge spike in infections, but things changed, and I think that was a very difficult moment for everybody concerned, especially after years of tightening the sort of domestic conditions of living, of expression, etc. in China.
As far as France is concerned, what were the positive outcomes of this trip?
I guess one important thing that Macron brought back was a promise by Xi Jinping to participate meaningfully in the June summit, send a high-level delegation, and do something. I don't know the extent to which that will be verified, but that was really important because
this is on climate.
Yeah, the one on financing climate and development. And the truth is that China has now taken such an important role, and we see that during the spring meetings of the IMF and World Bank here in Washington that have just ended this week. That now China is key to resolving many of the debt problems that we have. And so I think the international community failed in integrating fully China into, especially the IMF and World Bank, that is to say, re-evaluating or reconfiguring China's role in the Bretton Woods institutions, so that now China is sort of distanced from these institutions and is almost creating a parallel world, right?
But China also benefits from it in that, it's still classified as a developing country, which is, to me, kind of crazy. But that comes with with lots of benefits.
Of course,
for these major international institutions.
But still, I mean, we have a major problem on our hands, which is the lack of liquidity and the debt distress in which many developing countries find themselves. And China is a big part of that story. And it's no longer the case that you could gather all the countries in the Paris Club on debt and just erase the debt and the problem would go away, because now you have not only private creditors, but you have China. And so if you want to, so the situation has become much more complicated, and the attempts to include China and private creditors into the resolution of debt problems, like in the thing that was called the common framework, have essentially failed. And so that's a big concern, because it means that we are losing the leverage we once had on making sure that we could reconfigure debt and make progress and give some space and margin of maneuver for these countries. And so, once again, it seems to me that getting China to cooperate more on these issues, in which it has an interest, but of course it's playing its own cards, is important.
Before I continue my talk with Justin, a quick word from Mike Kaufman, host of The Russia Contingency.
Hi, Mike Kaufman here. You might know me from the Standing War on the Rocks podcast on the Russia-Ukraine war. Just want to remind you, have my own podcast, The Russia Contingency, where we do deep dives into questions about the Russian military, about the current conflict, have a lot of guests, analysts, historians. So head on over to warntherocks.com/membership and see if you want to sign up.
And now back to my conversation with Justin Vaïsse. So I know you're not in Washington for very long. I appreciate you making the time for this, but I imagine the elephant in the room for all of your meetings here is, President Macron's remarks to the media on his way back from this trip, and the story in Washington, where he's, I think it's fair to say, not the most popular international leader right now, are his remarks on Taiwan in terms of sort of trying to stake out an independent position about how France and Europe the rest of the world can't be drawn in a way that sort of depicted the United States as equally at fault about this as China. And that's obviously created a lot of grief in the city, not just among Asia hands, but also those who are frustrated with Macron over some of the diplomatic approaches he's taken towards Russia in the lead up to the war. So what are your responses to this?
So the main response is that I don't think the French position has changed a bit. And the position is the European one. That is, China is both a partner, a competitor, and a strategic rival, or a systemic rival. That's the exact terms of the European policy vis-à-vis China. I think Macron adheres to that. I think he also has still the same line on Taiwan. And if you look carefully at what he said in the French interview, because the political one was mixed with comments and I think didn't reflect accurately what he said, what he's worried about is that the increase in tensions around Taiwan will lead to a crisis that will basically distract us from precisely these issues of cooperation that I mentioned. But the French policy itself on Taiwan, whether on the substance or on what France should do, has not changed. And a good example was that just a day or two after he made his remarks, France conducted a FONOP, a freedom of navigation operation, which of course has nothing to do with Macron's remarks. It had been planned long before. But a French frigate went through the Taiwan Strait, which very few countries actually do. And France has been doing that since around 2012, 2013, whether in the South China Sea or in the Taiwan Strait. And so I honestly, much ado about nothing.
Oh, well, hold on there. I mean, even close partners of France, close allies like Germany, found fault in the way that Macron delivered this message, and it's been depicted that Germany feels like it has to go in and do its own cleanup now on its own visit to China. You have former French diplomats calling out Macron by name and in the press, saying that there's a real communication problem, almost an arrogance in how he communicates to international audiences. I don't think it's much ado about nothing, and I say this as someone, and you could go back and look at it, since just until a couple months or a month before the war, before the re-invasion of Ukraine, calling for diplomacy with Russia. I see the value of diplomacy. I think war is such a catastrophe that you should do extreme things to avoid it. I didn't criticize Macron for going to Moscow to meet with Putin before the war and to keep talking to Putin, but it just seems like there's a real communication problem in the way that he's communicating this to international audiences, even to me.
No, I agree there's a communication problem, but my point is that the substance of policy and acts talk louder than words, especially with a president that likes to brainstorm rather than pass on political messages at the end of his trips. And he's been a regular doing that type of thinking out loud, etc. And it almost always backfires on him and his communication, and that's where I find fault. But then on the substance of policy, once again, you won't find a German brigade going through the Taiwan Strait. And once again, German trade is about 3-4 times larger with China than that of France. And so let's look at facts.
And France does have the largest EEZ in what we call the Indo-Pacific, right?
And well, yeah, it's the second largest maritime domain, and of course, which implies a strong, a significant military presence, naval presence, simply because you need to defend that area, if only for biodiversity and protecting the stock of fish, etc. purposes, and of course that extends to strategy. We know that this domain in the Indo-Pacific is the main area of expansion of China, and France is in the front lines of that, and that's why the AUKUS deal 2 years ago in September 2021 was so painful, because France had been working with Australia precisely in reinforcing the containment, if you'd like, of Chinese vessels, mostly trawlers and fishermen, but also other types of boat going into the Pacific. And then suddenly he was sort of taken wrong-footed on that. And so...
No, listen, I'm with you on that. I was a critic of that at the time, one, because I don't think you should sort of deceive and sell out an ally like what we did. I also don't think that we're going to deliver the Virginia fast attack subs that we're saying we are. And I agree with my friend Zach Cooper, who made some great comments on net assessment about this. And I've talked to my friends, they know I think this, and I think that was a mistake. But I'll tell you something, is that after Macron's comments, all the pro-AUKUS people came out and we do not feel bad about that at all. We feel even better about that after hearing what Macron just said.
Yeah. But the thing is, the argument according to which that sort of casts the deal in different light, I don't really buy, because once again, if push comes to shove, that is to say, if there is a military contingency, you know what side France will be on, and Macron's comments have not changed that.
Let's talk about your actual day job. You were, when we first met, I believe, you were the sort of the equivalent of, you were the head of policy planning at the Ministry of Foreign and European Affairs. And now you left government to work on to stand up and run this important foundation. Could you talk about the work that you do?
So the Paris Peace Forum is actually two things. It's an event happening every November 11 in Paris, which gathers heads of state and government, private sector, civil society, think tanks, development banks, etc., all types of actors of international relations, and which tries to innovate in how we respond to global challenges. So basically, we're doing global governance. We're tackling issues like global health, climate, biodiversity, digital issues, etc., in a different way than national governments or the UN. We're building coalitions, and that the second thing that the forum is a policy organization managing coalitions. So one good example is the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace, which is a 1,200 member strong coalition now with 82 governments, more than 700 companies, and 300 civil society and local governments, etc., and which basically works on norms for cybersecurity, pushes laws, if you'd like, and standards to uphold and reinforce cybersecurity around. And we have several of these coalitions. One is on outer space and the sustainability of the low Earth orbit in particular. One is on critical minerals, and we have a couple of others. And so what we do is we try to bring a dose of coordination and standards and norms in a different way than what the UN does. That's the overall idea.
China actually takes a pretty interesting approach to global governance. We published an article in the Texas National Security Review, which our mutual friend Frank Gavin, who may or may not be sitting at the bar next to us, is the chair of the editorial board of, talking about how for China, global governance is actually a very competitive space. So you talked about how you're doing global governance in a different way than both the UN, but also, what's the relationship with China on this as well?
Yeah, well, to some extent that brings us back to the question of Taiwan, etc. Because for me, the question is to what extent will we be able to combine the growing US-China rivalry and the competition with cooperation? How much can we cooperate? How much can we compartmentalize and make sure that we focus on these issues that have become existential? I mean, in the 20th century, the only existential question was nuclear weapons, right? But in the 21st century, we have climate change, which potentially could kill a very high number of people or just eradicate the human species from the face of Earth. The planet will be fine, but I'm not sure about us. And obviously other things like perhaps lesser dangers like biodiversity, pandemics, etc. And so the question is how can we combine competition with cooperation? Can we just separate the two? Isn't there a danger that competition will always win and contaminate, if you like, cooperation and be weaponized even for competition? And are there ways in which the US and China can tame that competition and reduce the amount of animosity? And so that gets us back, I think, to Macron's interview. What Macron is saying is not that we should sell out Taiwan or that he won't intervene or he won't support in case of war. What he says is that we have all interest to cooperate to reduce the level of the fever, if you'd like, around Taiwan, because the cost is enormous, both in terms of danger that it could degenerate into war, but also in terms of cost of not cooperating. Listen to what John Kerry has been saying after the balloon affair, that he had no ties with his Chinese counterpart for weeks, etc. So this tension not only presents a risk of sliding into war, but also has a huge cost in terms of missed cooperation, if you'd like, on many of the things where we need China. I mean, I was mentioning debt earlier, climate, and a number of issues. So I'm not saying we should just sweep these issues under the carpet. That's not the point. The point is, how do we manage to keep the competition in check so that it leaves a space for cooperation?
That's a good answer. And I chuckled when you said balloon affair, because I think it's still just so funny that we had something called a balloon affair. I sort of can't get over that. Which brings me to my next question. You've studied these issues very closely as a scholar, because you're actually a very serious historian. You wrote a great biography of Brzezinski that I've not only read, but it's on my home office shelf. And of course, these are, as you know better than I, major issues during the Cold War. Is how do you balance cooperation with competition? Can you separate them? or are they just inextricable from each other? And how has your study of history, particularly during the Cold War, informed your approach to this going forward?
So that's really interesting because at the beginning of the Cold War, I think there was not much space for cooperation. But as the Cold War sort of settled in, and in the 60s and 70s, you saw a number of agreements, whether on strategic arms limitation talks on nuclear weapons, but also on the Antarctic, on health, on outer space, the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. So big binding UN treaties that were negotiated between two enemies that were pretty fiercely opposed to one another. And so the question is when can we get that type of cooperation between the US and China? It seems to me that at this time we are more on the sliding down confrontation, but hopefully there will be, as we saw during the Cold War, moments of détente, moments of relaxation of tensions, etc. And I hope they will leave enough space to solve the existential issues that we both confront.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was very interesting. General Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who's, I think has done a mixed job in his current role, but setting that aside, he said something that I actually rather agreed with, is that, we've leaned into the competition with China, but maybe lean back a little bit. Maybe I forget the exact language that he used, but he was targeting military leaders, is let's not treat war as inevitable. Let's not treat conflict as inevitable.
Honestly, I think that was pretty much what Macron wanted to say. Now he obviously, it came out a bit differently.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ryan. It was great.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the War on the Rocks podcast. Become a member at warontherocks.com/membership. Stay safe and stay healthy.